Oh.
How are you?
Not bad, how are you?
Yeah, good.
G'day, I'm Mitch. Welcome to Lounge Room Hobbies, and we're getting back on with Karanak this time, putting paint on him this time, not just an undercoat. But if you haven't seen the previous video, go back and check that out. There'll be a link floating around my head and in the description. You can look at how he was put together, gap filled, and put onto a cool Pride rock. Obviously I've done a big scenic base for Karanak. It's not particularly useful to hold while painting, and it doesn't let me do his underbelly if I glue him to it, so I blue tacked him to an old paint pot. It just means I can manipulate him a little bit more, get into the underbelly. There's not a giant rock in my way. Once he was attached to the paint pot, I started off by pulling out Troll Slayer Orange and laying in some patches and colouring over the top. As I said, I wanted to explore contrast paints, but I wanted to do something a bit weird with it. So I wanted a tone underneath the contrast. So I used really watered down Troll Slayer here so that some of the white would come through, and patched it around the tail, up his back and around his shoulders and legs. I then took Avalanche Sunset, which is a yellow, and did a similar thing, but this time for the kind of flame fur that he's got on his underside and on the tail and trailing edges of his legs. I then, having looked at this, added Avalanche Sunset to his belly, so this is a duller yellow. I wanted it to match those flames but be at the start of an underbelly tone. I find yellows tend to take a few coats. Just do coats. You can do one thick coat, but you might start to obscuring detail. Just take the time, let it dry, put another layer over, the pigments will build up. With all of those kind of undertones built up, I just hit the whole model with Flesh Terror's red, and honestly, this has made me fall in love with contrast paints. I experimented on it with my Skull Altar and using it as a weird tint to metallics, and I tell you, I'm going to add contrast paints to everything I do now because it was fast and it looks awesome. It also looks great wet, and that's just a function of the gloss, I think, but it does give me some ideas for some gloss effects that I want to do at some other point as well. But yeah, whole model hit with this. I tried to water it down a bit as I used it because I found that otherwise it was a bit too thick. It was particularly important along the top. I think it was immediately clear though is that it works best on this zenithal highlight or on a really pale highlight, because you get this shading where it's filling the recesses or running into those grayer patches. So it was really bright on top and dark underneath, which is exactly what I wanted. I found that as it was drying, I needed to move him around a bit, clean up some drips and drops. This was because I watered it down slightly, I didn't want it to pull in strange ways. Just got to pay attention to it, move the model around, clean it up with a brush if it's getting too bad. Then I started the highlights. So I wasn't going to escape the highlights. It was always going to happen because it's a centerpiece model. I want him to look really bright and different. So I opened with Evil Sun's Scarlet. But I started by checking every red I had. What was going to match? What matched this Flesh Terror's red and the tone I'd ended up with? I wanted something just a step above it. I ended up going with Evil Sun's red and just started picking out face details and higher raised ridges, so along the kind of spines of the frills, around claws, around muscle lines, where horns are up from the back, just starting to pick out greater detail. I focused a lot of these highlights around the face as well. That's something key. If you don't want to highlight the whole model, you don't need to, but spend some time on faces, because it's what people pick up and look at when they look at a model. With the red highlight done, I started adding some details in where I'd put in some orange layers. So this was starting to highlight the kind of spines on his tail and around his legs and the flame effects. I just wanted to start picking out some orange and adding back in some kind of fire and kind of motifs to it. I returned to Avalanche Sunset for his belly, but this time it wasn't a full belly, it was streaks and strokes and trying to get a pattern effect. I wanted a light undertone. Most animals have a light belly and a dark top. Karanak at the moment for me had a light top, a dark kind of flank and then a darker belly than the top, but it was still not like the flank. But I wanted that yellow to come back through, so I started highlighting that with Avalanche Sunset, lots of streaks rather than flat block colors. Really important step, don't forget that you drag that up under the chins, and there's 3 of them, so you can't miss them, especially the head that's looking directly upwards. Chins presented under the neck areas there, you need to highlight it, you need to pay some attention to it. I'd already added some orange highlights to the fur, but I decided it needed a little bit more, so I went with these like almost pin highlights in Uriel yellow. It's really bright, vibrant pop, but it was only constrained to the fur. I wanted it to be changing that undertone fur and the fur on his ankles. I decided to mess around with the frills. I had this white and I wanted to leave kind of higher edge white and start kind of build up from a grey through some blues. I started with a really watered down Mechanicus standard grey and washed it into the gaps because it was all pure white. So I'm adding depth, but not full black because that was going to be a bit strange. In some places I had to do this a lot, I had to leave it darker again. So the underside from the zenithal spray where there's a lot more black, I had to go through with that grey and be a lot heavier handed with it than I did on the top edges where it collected nicely in the recesses. Once this is dried, I started adding in tiny fine edged highlights in blue greys. So Thunderhawk grey, and there's another one. I can't remember it, but these blue greys, and this is what I was building up to. Right, adding it on the edges of the frill, with these brightest edges and leaving kind of dark recesses in the middle. Dark Reaper, folks. Dark Reaper grey is what I'm using here. So Thunderhawk grey and Dark Reaper grey, which happen to be blue greys. Lets me build up something slightly blue in there. The very last final step for those frills was actually to use Hoeth grey, which is very, very light blue, but it's kind of almost pasteled. If you water it down and apply it to a dark highlight, you get it it's a lower tone. Again, trying to pick out those blues and tying back to my Bloodthirster, who had blue wings, so carrying the blue membrane across things. Once I'd finished the blue highlights, I went back and retouched the red frills with Evil Sun's Scarlet again. So some of the points had been a little bit messy and ended up on the frill spine, so I picked them back out, made everything a bit brighter. Next step was to highlight all the claws on the model, and I was going for a really simple highlight here. So Karanak stone, really fine lines on every claw and every horn. This sculpt is great, they're really clearly defined, so it's really easy to add a nice sharp edge highlight. The trick, of course, water down your paint, spread it out, draw your brush through it, twisting your brush so that you bring your point back together, and then very gently just kind of lay in the line. Next step was to base coat the bronzes. So this was Warplock bronze, I believe, is the bronze base paint that I use. Very dark, so focused on the collars and the rune in his leg, and being super careful here, folks, because I just spent ages highlighting the frills and the red, and I'm insane, so I didn't do it first, because why not? If you take your time, you can get away with this kind of stuff. You just got to be patient and use a small brush. After adding in that base coat to the brass collar, I started to realize that the horns probably weren't as bright as I would have liked them to be, so I added in a sharp tip bone highlight. Same process here, but just starting to pick it out. I also found a few spots where I'd missed horns, so I went back through with the Karanak stone and then the sharp tip bone just to bring them up a notch. If you've been watching along with any of my other Khorne Army videos, and there's a few of them now, so definitely go check them out. There's a playlist for the rhinos, and you can check out the Bloodthirster as well. Spot color's green, but a blue-green that's based off Sybarite green, which here I brought into Karanak by doing his tongue and mouth, although mostly tongue. I do this now rather than before painting the teeth, so that I can be messy and not have to worry too much. So just watered down slightly, base coat. Once the tongue's dry, I come through with a very watered down Temple Guard blue highlight to those greens. It's focused on tip, so it gives me a fade that goes green to blue, which is a nice spot contrast to the reds that I use. I find this really helps to kind of tie it back to other points on the model and the frills, and it's not as garish or Christmassy as a pure green. So if you're thinking about wanting a spot color, you can tie it to other colors within its range on a color wheel and get it to tie in. If you don't have a color wheel, you can just put them down next to each other on a palette almost, or the pots next to each other and go, does this work as a strange highlight if it was watered down? And you can kind of experiment with it, which I'd strongly recommend. With the tongue painted and highlighted, I went straight to an Ashabdi bone base coat for the teeth. Next step was to add a recess wash. So rather than a total teeth wash and taking more brown and having to highlight a lot, I just dropped it into the gum line around the base. It darkens them in, makes them look a bit dirty and gritty and things stuck in the teeth almost. So hash nut copper is my go-to bronze highlight. Strangely enough, it's a copper rather than a bronze, but it gives a kind of a brightness that I really like using here, especially because I always wash my bronzes back down. So I aim for picking out edges and top edges in particular for the branded rune and his flank and around the collars as well. Then it was on to the eyes. So again, coming back to that super bright green, they're going green. Makes it nice and easy. I did mess around trying to do pupils. I ended up scrapping these and just going back to a pure green eye. Apart from the one surrounded by the scar, which got some washing of a milky white over it just to make it look damaged. Similarly, that scar I used, it's not flesh areas, there's a particular pink, I think it's horror pink or pink horror or something like that it's a purpley pink. I really should write my paints down. I'm going to start doing that. Watered down slightly, it works as a really great highlight over red. It's purpley pink, looks like scar tissue. That's what I focused around that torn up eye on the, I guess it's the third head. Once the highlight was in place for the scar wash, I then washed it down with Juchi Violet just to fill in that gap, give it some difference in tone. The rock I approached like other rocks that I've done. It's tying into my army, right? So I hit the whole thing with Skaven Blight Dinge. Covered the whole rock, pretty much covered the whole base. I was trying to keep it off the rim, but I mean, it's a big brush. And just stabbing motions to try and fill all the gaps and fill everything in. On the rock, I added a Mechanicus standard grey base coat to just the sand around the base of the rock. Then it was time to wash the rock. And normally I would use Nuln Oil, but it's a big rock. It'd be a lot of Nuln Oil. So I went for really cheap craft paint and water and just mixed it until it was runny enough that it wasn't that it basically wasn't paint anymore. It was more like water with paint in it, a little bit thicker than that, and put that all over the rock. Because of the way it's watered down, it's slightly different to wash paint, so you've got to be a little bit careful with it. You've got to add more water to your brush as you go along, but it does pretty much the same job. Obviously, the key thing here, shake your excess off once it's done. You're going to add a lot of water here. It's going to pool in strange ways. You just got to keep an eye on it so you don't get big pools in a way you don't like, because there was a lot on this thing when I was done with it. So with the rock dry from its wash, it's time to hit it with the dry brush. And I was really only concerned with dry brushing the stone, and I use Karanak stone for this. It ties into highlights I use in the army, and it also ties into every other base that I've done for the army so far. So I've got an old, very beat up, large dry brush Citadel one. It's pretty caked up. Got to work really hard to get paint out of it again. Trick with dry brushing is working paint off your brush as much as possible. Work it into a paper towel, into your palette. I've used my palm before. You want almost nothing showing up. And then when you hit the rock, magically there's still paint there. Less is more again here. Get most of it off first. You can always do a second pass, but you can't take paint off once it's on. Once you think you're ready, you start working it back and forth. With this brush again, because it's really beat up, I end up being quite heavy-handed with it, but that's fine. I wanted it to be quite a strong highlight. Then it was time to add Karanak to the base. You'll notice at this point I haven't painted the skulls that are on Karanak's kind of foot. I have painted the foot though. And this is because I knew that I wanted to build up some extra skulls around him when he went on. You can still see the space that I marked by pushing him into the sand, so he's got somewhere that locates his foot and puts him home. Almost like I planned it. So after test fitting, I glued him down with super glue. started using resin sand to blend him in once the super glue had gone off. So resin sand is a Liquitex product, and it's sort of like the texture pastes, I guess is the best way to describe it, that you can get from Games Workshop. If you've worked with those, you could use them in a similar way, but without two things. It dries clear. You can still see the beading in it because it has these little resin balls in it. It dries clear. You can mix it with paint if you wanted to, but it doesn't have any pigment in it, so it doesn't mess up if you're putting it around, and you can scrape it off with any kind of tool. It comes off the water, all that kind of stuff. So once I kind of blended in that rock with the texture paste, I then went to the skulls box and started piling in different skulls around the foot. I was adding these in with tweezer, so I wasn't disturbing what I'd put in with the resin sand too much. And of course, pushing it into the sand, it gives it somewhere to bond to, and works like a glue, which is great. So just added some more skulls to blend it in and make it look like it was supposed to be there. I also added a plague bearer skull tucked underneath in the cave, just because I could. I also found in places where I thought something wasn't particularly secure, I just kind of almost painted in super glue using a toothpick, dragged it around a little bit and secured things that way. Okay, it takes about 24 hours for the resin sand to cure, and once it's set, got to undercoat. So, undercoated the skulls and the sand black. I wasn't too worried about messing up around the dry brushing I'd already done. I had plans to make this a very different painted effect. So once I base coated the sand, I'd left a lot of the skulls unpainted, deliberately so. Came through with Wraithbone base, which is the paintable version of the contrast spray paint base coat. It's a weird sentence. I was hopeful that this would take pigment similar to like spraying would, because I planned on using glazes and washes rather than painting directly. So I started with a watered down wash of Ultramarines blue. Pretty sure you can't buy this blue anymore. Sorry. Any kind of, you want a brighter blue rather than a darker blue, but like a mid-range. You don't want the brightest blue, you don't want the darkest blue, because as you water it down, the pigment spreads out. Really light ones will go to opaque and dusky, and really dark ones will just stay dark and won't look good. So you want that mid-range blue. I wash that all over these white painted skulls, the flames that are coming off the skulls, to start building up an ethereal, ghostly look. Once that was dry, I came through with Temple Guard blue and started highlighting the flame itself. I wanted to really brighten this up. I want a blue contrast against the red. I'm trying to do something different. Bright, it's there, but it doesn't take away from the whole model. Next step was to start adding some kind of brown washes to all the different skulls. Again, I'm working in glazes and washes rather than direct paints. There's a whole wealth of different Games Workshop washes. Just use them in any mix you want if you want to do something similar. Once they were dry, I came through with a Sharptooth bone dry brush just quickly over the skulls, just to add some kind of top level highlights over those washes that I'd just done, pick them out again. And the final step was Guilliman blue glaze. Now, again, I know you can't get glazes anymore. I'm really lucky to have a pot. I have a plan to experiment and see whether the Games Workshop air paints might work in place of glazes. Keep that one under your hat. I want to do it first, don't you do it? No, I'm kidding, try it. If it works out, let me know in the comments below. The key thing here is that I use this to kind of get a shadowed highlight. It's a weird word, but I focused it into the depth of the skulls just to pick out some more blue. And lastly, I glazed in some Athonian camo shade into the Nurgle skull, the plague bearer skull underneath, just to give it a green tinge because it's a Nurgle skull, should be green. One of the last steps, as always, is to paint that base rim black to separate it from the board you're playing on. Looks really neat, better than a roughly painted kind of mix of greys like I had before. I added some patches of flock, some dead grasses that I've got, so some browns and some yellows, again to tie it into the rest of the army, and add some texture and something interesting. The last step was the mushrooms, and this was a chance to experiment with some different painting. So obviously sculpted them at the start of this, why wouldn't they go on this base? And I decided to mess around with some wet blending. Here's the other thing, folks, if you're not sure how to do it, try it. I had no clue what I was doing, and it still worked out here, blending some oranges into some creams. While trying to avoid a very, very scary flesh tone that was not at all suspect. Not at all, folks. Not even slightly. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make here is that I haven't wet blended before. And this was a great place to try it because it's on a throwaway piece to some extent. It doesn't matter if there's 6 layers of paint on it. It's a tiny mushroom I sculpted out of leftover green stuff. It's the epitome of doesn't matter. So you can try different things on these kind of things. You should do it. I encourage you to do it. I ended up adding some lighter highlights and some streaking to the mushrooms to make them a little natural. Trim them off their little skewers and super glue them onto the base around the Nurgle skull. Just seemed like a natural spot, a little cave. It's almost like the Nurgle skull's birthing these little fungus into the world, which I think is a really cool idea. And that's it, Karanak finished, built, painted. I mean, I tried a whole bunch of different things here. I really, really love how the contrast paint turns out as a base over white and that lovely fade. Hopefully you enjoyed this one. If you did, make sure to like the video, leave a comment telling me what you thought and what you think you'll try yourself. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Otherwise, I'll see you next time on Lounge Room Hobbies.